All right, we've heard how industry is staying ahead of the curve and why they must be enabled to do so at this inflection point. With sobering statistics like Iran firing 1,400 drones at UAE in just 1 week, something I heard from AV's CEO not too long ago, and Frontline's implications emanating from these wars, from decentralized command and control, laser communications for resilience, and advanced applications of directed energy for efficiency and cost savings, just mentioned by Church. The future of war is unfolding now, and we are getting ready for it. At this point, I'd like to turn my attention to our first panel of the day. Major General Hertz Vaughn understands this urgency more than anyone I know. And panelists, please come on up. Sure. I can think of no better professional to moderate this next panel. General Vaughn wears many hats in DOW, serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of War for Acquisition, Integration, and Interoperability, as well as the Executive Director, Joint Production Accelerator Cell, or JPAC, Joint Rapid Acquisition Cell, or JRAC, and others. A leader with experience in industry, including multiple startups, as well as an impressive military career, traversing the globe as a seasoned fighter pilot, strategist, and acquisition leader, Hertz is a go-to guy for expertise, passion, precision, and speed to all of us who know him. It's my honor to introduce you, Major General Vaughn, and your distinguished group of panelists for our first panel, rightly focused on fielding capabilities for our warfighters.
Thanks, Leanne. We're going to leave that chair empty because we have a dial-in group from INDOPACOM. And if you are there with your cameras, General Van Antwerp and Tianchi, you can go ahead and turn those cameras on. Otherwise, we will go audio only with them. But as Leanne said, I'm actually a trigger puller. That's what I've spent my career doing. And here I am leading 4 organizations in OSD, OSW acquisition. Why is that? Guy with no acquisition background shows up and does it about 2 years. Now I have some background. And I think it's because we want to go fast. Now, to be fair, they have surrounded me with acquisition professionals who can navigate the processes. But I think the reason you put trigger pullers and warfighters in certain jobs along the way, and it's an experiment, but the reason you do that is sometimes you don't want to follow the process. Sometimes you want to kind of bulldoze the process in the best way and keep moving and go fast. And so we heard that from earlier today. We heard that from Mr. Rucco. We've also heard that from the Honorable Mr. Duffy, that we need to go fast. Sometimes we need to go fast, damn the torpedoes. And I used to have a sign in my office that I've been asked to take down by some of my VC and PE buddies, and it said, red tape is really dressed up due diligence. Now, you guys out there that are responsible for due diligence might not appreciate that a whole lot. But anyway, here we are. We're going to talk about how do we go fast for warfighters. When the process, the acquisition system, when procurement, all the things we're doing out there, the defense industrial base, and there's some bright spots, and you heard about those today. When we get to the point that it delivers and it's late, or what the warfighters need today on the battlefield is not there, how do we get around that behemoth of a system while it still chugs along, because it's going to deliver at scale, and deliver things very quickly? First in our panel, I'm going to introduce Margaret Boatner, Vice President of National Security Policy at the Aerospace Industrial Association. And Margaret, you've previously testified that a strong DIB relies on clear demand signals, sufficient federal investment, a pro-innovation and adoption acquisition system, and a predictable and reliable budget. You outlined some clear paths for reform last summer. And how have things changed in the past year, particularly from a budgetary, requirements, and authorities perspective? And you've also discussed potential repercussions from CMMC on small businesses. And how is the government working with industry through all of this?
Sure. Well, thanks to MITRE for hosting, and very excited to be here. Yes, I'm here on behalf of Aerospace Industries Association, and just for context, we represent about 300 members of industry, ranging from your traditional primes all the way down to kind of small mom and pop shops. So we do get kind of a representative voice of what the defense industrial base looks like right now. And I would say, from industry's perspective, frankly, lots has begun to change since I testified last year. Congress and the department and the White House have kept, frankly, I think everybody on their toes, certainly industry on their toes over the course of the last year. A lot of the reforms that they've announced, I'd say, are still very much in flight, so we've yet to see the outcome of some of these things, but I think a couple of really key wins on behalf of industry or from industry's perspective. I'd say the first is the adoption of this multi-year approach, which is kind of the new approach, at least particularly within the munitions space. I think industry has long called for demand stability when you're asking industry to make really large investments that are needed to ramp up production. And so for the first time, frankly, we're seeing really, really kind of rapid adoption. I think 15 or so of these multi-year frameworks have been announced to date. And so that's huge. That really gives industry kind of the signal that it needs to be able to invest into ramp production. And obviously in munitions is of critical importance right now. So that's one. I'd say dissolution of the requirements process is another huge one. Everybody knows that process takes 2 years to validate a requirement through the old JCIDS process, and they've effectively dissolved it. Now, we don't know what's going to be in its place. I think that's still underway. But they've intimated that there will be a new organization that will incorporate industry input, which will be huge. It'll help inform, what technologies actually exist in the private sector, so the department has that information when they're thinking through requirements. And several of the department leaders have talked about 80% solutions are good enough. And so understanding what that really means, what is 80% instead of taking 2 to 3 years to get to 100% very prescriptive requirement? What is that 80%? And then can we iterate from there? That's all very exciting for industry and the companies that seek to do business with the department. And then lastly, I'd say huge deregulation push right now. I think it was mentioned in one of the last sessions, but they're rewriting the Federal Acquisition Regulation and all of the agency supplements. Those things are behemoths of thousands and thousands of regulations that companies have to comply with. And so they're rewriting it for the first time. And so we're hoping to see some meaningful change out of that. I think to your point, one of those regulatory requirements is CMMC, which is the cybersecurity requirement that is now in place, effective as of this past November. That's a huge burden, particularly for small businesses, right? We have members who have told us it has cost them upwards of $1 million just to comply with CMMC, and that's the one-time upfront cost to comply. There will be an annual recurring cost to comply, and so these small businesses don't have the cash flow nor the compliance kind of infrastructure to oversee this. And in many instances, we're seeing kind of an inappropriate application of cybersecurity requirements. Where they're saying this is CUI or FCI information, which is just the information that they want protected via CMMC. It's flowing all the way down to these mom and pop shops who are now going to have to put out $1 million. So we're hearing from a lot of these guys that they will leave the defense marketplace if they have to. And so we're working with the department. There are lots of thoughts about cost sharing for some of the costs on small businesses, but also working with Congress and the Small Business Administration as it comes to some kind of tax credit. And then AIA, we've launched a CMMC marketplace to help folks kind of understand and comply with the regulations. So just as an example.
Well, thank you, Margaret. And I will point out to the crowd that this journey for me in acquisition, every day is an educational process. And Margaret has given me a crash course in CMMC, and I'm starting to understand some of the challenges there. So I really do appreciate that. But you talked about the signal to ramp. And once a company gets that signal to ramp, and again, I'm not talking about, we say all the time we want you to ramp, but you need monetizable paper, right? Monetizable paper, then you ramp. How do you do that? So that brings up our next guest, Dhruva Rajendra, CEO of Deterrence. And you and I have gotten to know each other over the past couple of months, and you're clearly at the forefront of innovation with Deterrence and are helping bridge the gap in production through tech advancements. And actually, it's quite exciting to see. Would you talk a bit about why you started the company, where you saw the gaps, and how you see critical advancements like advanced autonomous manufacturing changing how we address critical munitions in the air and land domains, and specifically in an era of cost per target and growing disparity? How do we get after this problem more effectively?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, Deterrence, we've been around a few years. We're a venture-backed tech company. We're focused exclusively on one thing, which is Hertz alluded to, which is boosting munitions capacity in the country. We're not creating new capabilities. We exclusively focus on working with defense primes to scale up production. And in the last 3 to 4 months, you can guess we've been quite busy working across large caliber systems, some missile stuff, and some other things we'll announce in the coming few weeks here. Kind of the origin story of the company, many of us came from kind of a commercial background. So we built factories in Asia, across the United States, and one of kind of the key insights we had as we sort of looked at, maybe supporting the defense industrial base was that the way you build a factory in Asia and the way you build a factory in America is very different. The way you build a factory in Asia is you just throw a lot of human bodies at it, but it's not just kind of unskilled workers, right? It's a lot of engineers, a lot of artisan labor. When you come back to the US, a lot of that workforce just doesn't exist. We've underinvested in engineering, we've underinvested in those skilled laborers. We don't have the same trade ecosystem that they do in Asia or other parts of even Europe. And so what we saw was that, whether you're talking about commercial industry, frankly, or defense, we were going to have to figure out how to bridge those production gaps some other way. And that's what led us to start the company around these concepts that we could actually bridge the gap with software, with AI, some of the new things that are happening. We kind of feel like maybe the United States has been behind for the last 3 to 5 years, but with some of the new things coming online around artificial intelligence, it might actually let us spring past some of our peers across the ocean. And so that's what we've been focused on.
Fantastic. And I'm actually really looking forward to seeing how this plays out. We have had a system in some cases of perverse incentives where we have encouraged scale and ramping without the requisite improvement and modernization of those factory floors and those manufacturing areas. So really exciting. Looking forward to that. Let's now go to the away team. Actually, a guy who's pulled a lot more triggers than I have, and I really appreciate both of you joining us. So SES, Mr. Tianchi Wu, is the USARPAC Future Plans Director. Major General Jeffrey Van Antwerp is the commander of U.S. Special Operations Command Pacific. The team in INDOPACOM understands the time, space, force, distance challenge intimately. And how does this impact your approach to fielding, testing, operationalizing capabilities with that speed that are essential to deterrence and readiness in the INDOPACOM theater? And what is changing, and what should the rest of the acquisition ecosystem be focusing on to support you? And a hearty welcome to you, Tianchi Wu and Major General Van Antwerp. Over to you.
You guys?
Loud and clear.
Okay, great. Yeah, first, appreciate the big screens there. We got kind of a aura going behind us here. So yeah, this is Johnny to my left. Jeff Van Antwerp, the SOCPAC commander out here in the Pacific out here. Obviously, in time of crisis or conflict, particularly one that would have, a short kind of period of indicators and warnings, which is like we'd respect, like anybody, folks would be looking to gain an element of surprise out here, our adversaries. You really got to have the capability forward. As we look at, our current relationship with industry and what we're trying to do, working with other folks, particularly the Defense Autonomous Warfare Group, others in the Department of War, to get capability out here into the Pacific. We've got both the urgency to get the capabilities out that we need for our plans, and I'll speak to a little bit of some of our major kind of current interest in priorities. But really, our number one duty out here is deterrence, obviously to prevent a war from ever happening. And to do that really requires getting combat credible capability forward. I think it was said well there earlier, that does not mean capability that's 100% foolproof. That has been, definitely, I'd say, perfect as the enemy of good or the enemy of good enough. We are very interested in the 80% solution that we can then take and iterate with industry on and do that here forward. This past week, I just came from the Philippines, got back in about 2 days ago, where we were out working with what are for us some experimental programs, Magura USV, some other UAVs, but for others have been iterated on a lot in other theaters. And what we tend to find is that every theater is a bit different. Even if something is a proven capability somewhere else, or it's been proven at a testing range by a vendor, it doesn't necessarily work as advertised in this theater, and that's totally okay. we want to get it out here. We want to test it in our environment, the heat, the humidity, forward in the first island chain, where we look to do a lot of our operations from really within that kind of challenging terrain, those island archipelagos, and we want to test it. We want to iterate with industry on it. We want to improve it. It's important from both a demonstration perspective, combat credible capability here forward in the first and second island chain to deter, but it's also really important for us to be able to train on it, be able to integrate it into our warfighting concepts, into our plans, into the ways that we intend to support the joint force, and really figuring out how do we organize ourselves around it. I think we find, much like our buddies over there, Jasper Jeffers, if you know the SOC CENT commander over in the Middle East right now, you cannot just take a lot of these technologies, just drop them on folks last minute and expect them to be able to employ it well, even just at the very tactical level, much less integrate it in a plan or an overall joint force operation. As many of these things, there's, particularly we talk about our major needs, which are longer range one-way attack in the air and the maritime and in the subsea, tactical mission networks to integrate some of these systems, a lot at the unclass level, and integrate partners to be able to move that data and move it to support the joint force. Sensors that can sense passively, generate target quality data, be able to communicate to the joint force to enable our longer range, higher end weapons. And then a lot of the, which I think Tianchi talked a little bit about, our ability to disrupt the enemy's ability to target us. That's a huge thing that we are looking to do out here in support of the joint force. But we're finding that you can't just take your normal organization, drop these things in on top of an SF ODA or a SEAL platoon and just expect them to be able to automatically go and employ it with 4 or 5 days of training. We want to iterate with the vendors. We want to get it forward, figure out how we organize ourselves around it. That's going to require us a bit of kind of force design change. Getting these systems forward isn't just about employing them either. It's about understanding how do we store them, how do we sustain them, how do we maintain them, how do we train them, and then ultimately employ them. So being able to look at them a bit from the .mil-PF perspective, I'll particularly start talking about lethal munitions that require kind of a care and handling and in storage just to be able to do it safely. So we're very encouraged by the way things are going, by sort of the speed and the iteration and being a little farther left in that developmental cycle. We absolutely don't expect perfection. We just want an engaged partner who's highly motivated in industry to see their thing be successful, that we can iterate and work with, preferably here forward, demonstrating the capabilities so that both our partners and ourselves and our adversaries can see it. I'll pass it to Tianchi and get his perspectives.
Thanks, sir. And thanks to Hertz and to Leanne for inviting us to be part of this panel. I'm very grateful to join General Van Antwerp here as one of only 2 Indo-PACOM components to make the cut to be a part of your prestigious panel here. I think the shortest answer to your question, Hertz, what is the best way to field and test and operationalize some of these emerging capabilities, is to mirror as closely as practicable the way that Army forces and Special Operations forces envision how we would have to operate in the Indo-Pacific. You mentioned this great time, space, distance problem that we face in the Indo-Pacific. This is 52% of the Earth's surface area in this theater. But compounding that problem is also what the adversary, what China is doing to complicate our operating concept, what China's version of what we're talking about today, what they've done in terms of rapid modernization and capability development over the past 30 years has focused on how they can develop what they call counter-intervention capabilities that keep the U.S. joint force from projecting power across this vast distance that you talked about. So that is the big problem set that is working against us. What are some of our advantages that we have working for us? Number one, between Army forces, Marine forces, and Special Operations forces, we believe that those sets of forces have this unique capability to still persistently operate within a certain range of those counter-intervention capabilities, primarily sensors and munitions. And that these forces, because they can operate at very low signatures, they can be very mobile, they can disaggregate, can still pre-position certain capabilities and employ those capabilities in crisis and conflict. So that's how kind of the nature of those forces, I think, is one advantage. The other one, which I think is the focus of today's panel, is a set of, thanks to a lot of what industry and OSW and the Joint Force has done over the last 3 to 5 years, a set of emerging capabilities that are exactly what you would want those SOF, Army, and Marine Corps forces to employ if they had this unique ability to stay within a certain range of China in that scenario. And these are electronic warfare capabilities, sensing capabilities, what we call counter C5 ISRT capabilities, which are, simply put, small form factor capabilities that would disrupt China's ability to target, to sense, target, and strike U.S. forces. So exactly the kinds of asymmetric capabilities that you would want those inside forces to employ are exactly what industry and different partners across OSW and the Joint Force have been developing over the last 5 years or so. And we are here in INDOPACOM the happy beneficiaries of a lot of those emerging efforts coming out of this great innovation ecosystem from OSW, R&E, ANS, DARPA, SCO, and then at the service level, our TENCAP office within the Army, the technical exploitation of national capabilities, that has been working with industry to develop a lot of these emerging capabilities that are a great advantage for land forces, SOF, and Marines that are operating in this theater. So to kind of close up your question, how do we envision experimenting, employing, pre-positioning these capabilities is as close as we can to that operating concept I just described. Land forces disaggregated along the first island chain, pre-positioning these EW, counter C5 ISRT capabilities, long-range one-way attack capabilities that General Van Antwerp mentioned, and employing them, exercising them, experimenting with them at smaller scales, to close kill chains for the Joint Force, to rehearse exactly what we think that operating concept might look like in a crisis or conflict scenario inside of an experimentation or an exercise in peacetime.
No, that's a fantastic perspective, and really glad that we had one of our warfighting commands join us today. It kind of goes back to something that General Dale White mentioned earlier, where operations and acquisition are starting to become gray. And I think that is not only intentional, but it's a very good thing. And the question is, how do we navigate that? And so we need really somebody to bat cleanup and come in with a broad perspective on the lessons learned. And so we have Matt McGregor, a board member with the Creative Defense Foundation. And Matt, you have explored acquisition challenges from industry, including recent time at Anduril. You had nonprofit Vantage Point and an FFRDC, and supporting government teams from ANS to the Air Force. Your weekly Substack, and I think many of you are probably subscribers to that, is a must-read for many of us in the field. It certainly is for me. And if you were to distill your findings in 2 to 3 big lessons learned and recommendations for 2026 based on those roll-ups, what advice would you offer?
Only 2 to 3, huh? So no, thanks for having me, Miter, and yeah, great panelists here. Great to hear from the end user who's using it, and I think that's going to be one of the themes for my thing here. But yeah, I started to try to think about how to condense down and try to be novel. I think everyone's kind of heard, yeah, if we had completely flexible money, that would be easier. There are some key things that I think everyone needs. So I'm going to try to throw out a couple more novel thoughts here for the audience. And I tried to think about what we have in the system today. Jim Ruocco mentioned, we have leadership support, congressional alignment. That's a really unique thing to have, those two forces pushing in the same direction. Maybe we want Congress to push a little bit more in the direction of funding the funding piece, but we have pretty good alignment there for moving faster, engaging more industry, and being able to get things fielded faster. So there's a slew of prototypes. Like I do the news wrap up with my colleague every week, and you just read. There's a new company coming out with a new thing. I'm sure in your business, you're seeing it too, not just like little software widgets, but full-on, high-end capability stuff that these non-traditional contractors are pushing, and the primes increasingly are investing in. And when I was at Antral, I really did get an education in that. I did not fully appreciate just the capability out there in those in that non-traditional sector, how smart those guys are. Like, they can really pull something together when they're given the energy and incentives. So we have tons of prototypes, tons of things out there, and IndoPACOM and increasingly CENTCOM, they're experimenting with them. We have a lot of privately funded stuff, like I just talked about. We have highly engaged combatant commands. So we have a user base. We're not just relying on a service rep that's deep in the bowels of the bureaucracy like many PMs used to have to. We have engaged combatant commanders who are actually going to use this capability that's fielded. And we have a lot more funding potential. I'll just say that. If you look at reconciliation in 27, if we even get a piece of that, that is going to provide a good chunk of funds for hedge capabilities. So what do we still need? What are the lessons? One of the things that I think we are not good at today, and that will be a huge acquisition challenge that we need to get better at, is because of this plethora of potential solutions that we could pull in, and I'm sure the combatant commands get overwhelmed too. There are so many possibilities. We need to get better about managing that ecosystem, and not just within our stovepipes across services, but being able to look across all OSD. So if you have a capability gap, their joint staff is working on joint operational problems. They're going to decompose them into mission threads that the MIA can run things against. They're doing the sequence of operational challenges over the next 4 years. But in that, there is a lot of potential to address pieces of that. The Air Force might have a piece of that puzzle. If you're a Navy PM, you should be aware of what that Air Force PM might be doing. DARPA might have a piece. SCO might have something. The ability to pull the threads, I think we need to get a lot better on, because we really do have an innovation ecosystem, and the combatant commands are engaging in that. And I think the PMs need to understand the full potential, because if we are moving to a world, and I love to hear the Chief of Space Ops, Saltzman, just kind of put out an edict to his workforce, to the Space Force community, and say, I want you to field MVPs. Well, if you're going to field MVPs, you really do need to look broadly, because you could pull a piece in, field that fast, have this other thing going on as your next increment, and constantly be looking and making decisions upon which things are going to graduate, which things need more work. And PMs, I think, are just going to have to get better about that, and the system's going to have to support that. Greater flexibilities just to get on contract. I think contracting we will run into the buzzsaw of that, because given how dynamic all of this is, we are going to have to move faster and have more complex potential arrangements as we move into different types of business models, and we have different structures that we're trying to integrate private capital. So the contracting workforce really, I just wanted to hit that point, is if we don't get things on contract fast, then everything else kind of slows down, and we're never going to get things to the field as fast as they need to. So we need to have that sort of primed, that pump primed, and to educate that workforce on all the potential things. The FAR reform, how to do OTs, how to do competitive multi-down selects. MITRE has written some really good playbooks on that, but we need to institutionalize that. And then, the combatant commands having more say in the process, I think that was kind of hit. But the last one that I really wanted to get after is get better at fielding sustainable MVPs. So, you're a PM, you're managing the innovation ecosystem, you know all the things that are out there, all the potential. The key is you go out there and you do an experiment, and the different, J8 IndoPACOM's like, this is perfect. You go back, you work with the Navy, Air Force, you get some buy-in, that PM gets some buy-in from their operational community. They're like, here are the CONOPS that we could develop. Here's how we could sustain this thing for an interim, then we'll go to a fuller strategy. We need to build that muscle memory for being able to field a sustainable MVP, where if something is successful in an experiment and you have an engaged industry, and you can say, yes, we really like that thing, we're going to scale that. You could get some private capital to get it put against that, to maybe get the manufacturing ecosystem primed before the next money comes in the next budget cycle. But you have enough juice in the system to be able to field that MVP and have some of the illities addressed. They may not be perfect, but we need to get the system used to that. Right now, we're still taking, ATOs, for instance, are still, Second Front put out a report, not less than 6 months. They're still taking 6 months to get, their first ATO. And we're seeing this with all the certification processes. We're basically doing the same certification process as we always did, as if we're fielding, a hypersonic missile for every capability. And we need to get those certification processes, all of those kind of internal PMO things to be able to go faster and find that MVP, find that sweet spot between all of those. You need to think about life cycle, but there's a sweet spot. You need to think about the affordability piece, but there's a sweet spot about do you need a year-long ICE to do that, or can you do some informed, quick analysis based on a bunch of different inputs? So I think those are, I would just say, some of the key things is just getting better at building that sustainable MVP, managing that dynamic ecosystem. And then one last thing I would just add as part of that innovative ecosystem is having the data models and things available to small businesses where they can quickly get access to operational data to validate some of their assumptions when they're making those investments. Because we hear that a lot, that they're like, I built this thing, is it any good? And now taking them to an experiment is great, but that takes a lot of operational manpower. If we had a good system that they could go pull the right data, pull the right threat models, pull the right mission threads, and be able to run their solution against that and say, yeah, actually, if you incorporate this and this, it does change the game. Or maybe I need to put more energy into this piece of it because actually where my roadmap was going is actually not the right way. So I think those are some things that we could probably get after to help accelerate. So hopefully that was helpful.
No, that's great. I appreciate that, Matt. And one of my roles up here as the moderator is to keep us on our time frame. And I want to allow for a couple of questions from the crowd. I do have one follow-on that I'll bring to the INDOPACOM folks. But I think it was in one of your Substacks, Matt. You said China, and maybe somebody else, but you said China is not waiting for us to achieve milestone B. They're just moving out. So with that as sort of the backdrop for Jeff and Tianchi, talk about China very briefly, please. They are not 10 feet tall, but they might be 9.5 feet tall. Where are their advantages? What are we doing about it? And where do we actually have some asymmetric advantages or could get some pretty quickly? Over to you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So I'll kind of quote my old boss first, General Flynn. He used to say, China's got three main advantages: mass, magazine depth, and interior lines. And I think what they've, and those certainly, I think that applies to certainly the interior lines. You can look at, they're just a short distance from the first island chain, and particularly Taiwan, which should, that's obviously, we've got much larger distance challenges. But the mass and magazine depth, I think historically we've applied that a lot to kind of the PLA rocket force and a lot of their conventional munitions. But we also see them pushing really hard on AI, as mentioned earlier in a previous speaker, but also in the unmanned systems realm, as they look to, they're one of the largest, the largest producer of unmanned systems, albeit, DJIs and, all kinds of stuff for hobbyists, but they're absolutely parlaying that into, they got well over, about 1,500 or so, like longer range drones. We think like group 3 and above, group 4, 5s. And then a host of one-way attack capabilities they're developing. So they're absolutely moving out on it. I think to Matt's point, part of our, I think our strength is our ability to rapidly innovate at the edge. We believe that they are more constrained in their ability to rapidly innovate at lower levels and provide that tactical feedback up. It's a lot of top-down and a lot of state-owned enterprise that are driving a lot of their innovation. It doesn't mean it's not good, but I think our opportunity is to more rapidly evolve our capability. And really, it does come down to, I think Matt said it really well, those kind of sustainable MVPs, that sweet spot of how much do you scale to incentivize industry to actually build and to build the production lines. We're experiencing that right now with some of the efforts up there with the department. And then how much do you leave yourself open to continue to evolve the capability? I think there's a lot of ways to do that. There's building things that what you may be willing to stockpile as long as you can improve upon the tech stack on top of it. The kind of the hardware and the body, fine. The more COTS those parts are so that we can make those adjustments forward, closer to the edge, super important. As we're discovering over there with our folks over in the CENTCOM AOR, and as we've seen in Ukraine, the more that you can continue to evolve the capability once it's come off a production line and kind of retrofit it for emerging technologies, the better. A lot of that can be done by software, but hardware is an important part of that as well. When we start talking about operating in, really difficult environments where, whether it's the environment itself from the weather, or the places you're gonna have to put it or store it, to the electromagnetic interference and adversary capabilities you expect to face. So I think that our tactical innovation all the way to the edge, which is a bit of a new model with industry and tech engineers all the way down to the tactical edge, kind of the last cover and concealed to continue to iterate on the capability, is our strength and will continue to be our strength. And I don't think that they'll be able to replicate that. Over.
That's outstanding. Tianchi, did you have something to add on to that?
Yes, covered all the physical dimensions. There's mass, interior lines, sustainment, speed. What we're seeing, what our G2 is really spending a lot of time on, keeping an eye on over the last couple years, is how is China doing its version of exercises and rotations really along the East Coast. What we used to call strategic warning of a conflict in the Indo-Pacific has grown more and more ambiguous, and this element of surprise that China has to be able to rapidly transition to a real conflict from the guise of an exercise is a much shorter time span than it used to be. So that's all on the operational side. On the, I guess you could call the business side, this state-owned enterprise, civil military fusion that China has is very different from the more decentralized approach to innovation and capability development on our side. You could say there's a kind of a hidden advantage to that. I think, and if you take any snapshot of any one moment, it'll look a lot more messy on our side. How the different services, whether you look at it in terms of those stovepipes or different industry sectors, it won't look very efficient. We'll have a lot of overlap, I think. Even maybe some cross-cutting, efforts. But I think in total, and we observed this across the services here at INDOPACOM, what we've got developing really from the bottom up has been a pretty good PACE plan, a primary, alternate, contingency, emergency set of operational approaches. They might not look super joint or super well coordinated, but there is a lot of uncertainty on how a conflict in the Indo-Pacific might play out. What capabilities in space, for example, would be available to the U.S. Joint Force in such a contingency. And across all of our services, largely uncoordinated, I think we've developed a pretty good, in aggregate, set of backup plans where each of our services are looking at, what is their set of capabilities best equipped and best positioned to do in a China scenario. In aggregate, I think we've all got the bases pretty well covered. So that's a kind of a hidden advantage of not being a super top-down, centralized set of joint concepts. I think we've got a much larger span of potential contingencies covered.
No, that's great. And what I'd like to do is ask our panelists to be thinking about a 30-second or less final cap on what you've said today and what we've talked about. Meanwhile, let us open it up for just a couple of questions. Nothing heard. We're going to, no, sorry. Not off the hook that easy.
Thank you. So we, as industry, I'm Dawn Massa Sienkiewicz, Massa Products Corporation, small business. We do sensing and systems and design for production.
That's Massa, M-A-S-S-A?
Yes, it is. And we're hearing the demand signal in terms of concept, but it's often a wild goose chase to actually get from point A to point B to secure the initial visibility required to really invest the money to go after whatever. And if we're getting into certain classified space that we kind of have already figured out, to have that protection is essential if we're going to go ahead and develop a product prior to selling and delivering 80% or better at scale. So what can be done so that the speed to clear the essential people and get them in the field to be able to deliver in months, not years, how can we fix that problem? Because if the clearance process takes longer than the development, that's an issue.
Let me go to Margaret for that one. And again, you've got the sub-tier suppliers who are building against a requirement they're not allowed to see.
Yeah, sure. No, that's absolutely part of the problem. And again, I think we're industry in general is asked a lot to kind of invest ahead of need, which can be very, very challenging when you have to go to your board of directors and say, hey, can I pump this much money into something? And it may result in a contract eventually, and it may get budgeted and appropriated by Congress, but we're not entirely sure. And again, with the requirements process changing in general, it just injects more uncertainty into the entire process. So I think, can't speak on behalf of the department. I know that they are working to inject more industry input into the requirements development process. And I think what we have asked of both them and of Congress is a little bit more predictability and stability. And so again, the thing that I would point to is on these multi-year procurements, that's an example of where you give industry what industry is asking for, and by that I mean some kind of stability over a certain amount of time. And it doesn't always need to be a 7-year contract, but when you're asking us to ramp in the munitions space, it does. But in other areas, if you can give us the predictability that you will appropriate for something and that you can clearly define the requirement, industry will meet the moment. And so I think there are several efforts underway to get after both of those things. But the department and Congress are two separate players. Even within Congress, authorizers and appropriators are two separate players. So there's a lot of uncertainty for industry, and if we could help to clarify some of that, industry certainly is kind of ready, I'd say, to meet the moment.
Leanne, one more question, or should we go to the wrap-up? We'll do one more from the crowd. Back corner, go ahead, sir.
John Stow, I do a lot of things, including NDIA Architecture Committee Chair, and I started the MOSA Summit. So me and 1,000 of my best friends that run small businesses have a question for you guys, and that is that it's a lot of focus has shifted to warfighter engagement, direct, like let's get the innovators out there. So if you've got $1 billion founder and you can take a trip to Hawaii to come visit those guys, you can play in an exercise. But how do we get that information distilled down to all the other small business innovators in a digital environment so that we can do virtualized, continuous integration of concepts with warfighter engagement when there's only so many warfighters to go around? There's lots of small businesses, lots of innovation opportunity, but the surface area of contact for warfighting exercises and small businesses in a marketplace is too small. How do we increase that? Thanks.
That's a fantastic question. Dhruva or Matt, one of you want to jump on that?
Yeah, I mean, we're supporting a few companies. If you all are familiar with the Drone Dominance Program, we've been actively working with a few companies. So for those who aren't familiar, it's a gauntlet. So company shows up, here's our design, they get scored on what should be an objective manner, and then they go through different tranches. And as they go through different tranches, there's new challenges, and a lot of it's around scale up, which is kind of where we come in. I think what has been good is that it's allowed companies that, at least, I mean, we didn't have like about 10 of the 20 that won on our radar, and we feel pretty plugged in. And so I think something like that, if it could get scaled across different programs, I think that would be super important. Now, I think there will still be programs, say bigger missile systems, where there's a lot of integration that has to happen, where those maybe we'll have to figure out different mechanism. I don't think we want 20 people coming up with a Tomahawk and screaming at NavAir that they want their best design in a tube or something like that. But I think in certain cases, the gauntlet model could get rolled out to other systems, especially in something like drones, where those things are changing basically every month.
And we'll give Matt a bite at that, but right after that, we'll go to INDOPACOM for the lightning round of closing comments. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I think the only final point on that one is that I think we do need better knowledge management about all these different things that take place, because you do have exercises, experiments, and people doing mission engineering analysis, but it becomes very hard to share that with industry in a cohesive way. So, that was definitely one of mine.
Great. And I know there's other questions. I encourage you to use the networking break for those questions. INDOPACOM, closing comments, 30 seconds or less, lightning round.
Totally. I can't empathize with you, but I can sympathize with you on the warfighter engagement, because there is only so much surface area, and I think that is where it's on us to really detail our requirements, provide them to I think maybe one of you kind of used the word kind of like screamers. You know, it is like drone dominance program, Greg Merkel and the team there, the dog, you know, folks that are, have more kind of that can provide a hub to provide you those requirements, knowing that not all of you can come out here to Hawaii or the Philippines or Japan or somewhere else to have direct interface with guys, you know, completely down there on the edge. So thank you for that. John?
And thanks a lot, Hertz. I think bottom line from the USERPAC side is really over the last year or two, we've been very heartened by all of the joint efforts, service efforts, and we're, like I said, the happy beneficiaries of a lot of those innovation ecosystem initiatives that are pushing capabilities out to this theater, whether it's the Defense Autonomous Warfare Group, within the Army, the GTED, the Global Tactical Edge Acquisition Directorate, that's placing a little bit of that acquisition within ASALT, closer co-located with USERPAC. There's the Munitions Acceleration Council that's been working at OSW, and even looking out to next year, a ton of those key shortage munitions coming out to this theater for pre-positioning and experimentation. So just very grateful on the theater side for all of those efforts from the business side of the War Department coming out to the Indo-Pacific.
Acquisition is getting simpler in a way, and actually I think we lived in the simpler world where like we had a few big programs and we put all of our energy on that, and it was just about, you know, beating up on Lockheed or Northrop or whoever to like get the program through. We live in, it's actually acquisition, I think, is we're going to have to become much more sophisticated users of the authorities that we have in terms of being able to have quick decision support about which vendor we take forward, which one we give feedback for them to go back to the drawing board, which ones we kind of keep in a warm status, which ones we scale. We're going to have to get much better about that, because as the private capital is flooding in, as we have more opportunities, we're going to have to come up with more creative strategies and be better customers and all those things that we've talked about. So anyway, I just want to throw that out there, as I would like people to think about how we can live and operate with all the flexibilities and make sense of them, and help PMs get the training and understanding to be able to make sense of them so that the warfighters can get capability faster.
Very good, Matt. Thank you. Dhruva, sir, over to you.
2 points on that point. I've heard 1,000 times like we need 80% solutions for the field. I think I've heard 0 times which 80% matters. And so my guidance to the ecosystem would be, tell us what the 80% is and we'll get on it. The second one, I'm gonna come back to a question you asked earlier about, you know, where is America strong versus China weak? And I think that on we think about it, the industrial production side, 2 different buckets, the electromechanical side and the energetic side. Energetic side, that builds all the way to rockets, missiles and stuff like that. I think I believe anyways that our production capabilities there exceed, what we build is better than China's. We put people on the moon. Like we send so much stuff to space that when my kid sees the SpaceX video every Saturday morning, he's like bored by it now. On the electromechanical side, which is downstream of the smart devices we buy, robots, things like that, that is where we are hilariously behind. I am closer to being LeBron James than we are to keeping up with the Chinese on this. And so what I would say is, as we think about industrial policy, keep pushing really hard on missiles, but we got to figure out how to get things like drones and stuff like that out to the warfighter as quickly as possible, because that's where we are very behind. And yeah, that'd be my 2 cents.
Fantastic. And Margaret, deliver us from this panel. Take us home.
All right, well, I don't know if this is going to be the sexiest answer folks have ever heard, but I think, you know, we've talked about tons of reforms that are underway. We're seeking new authorities. We're trying to get budget flexibility. We're doing this, that, and the other. And to Matt's point, none of it works if you don't actually have the folks that can execute it. And so at a time where there's a smaller acquisition and contracting workforce than ever before, and all the rules of the road are changing, what our companies are seeing is that they are going in and saying, hey, you're asking for a commercial first approach, let us sell this to you commercial. And the department is saying no. And so I think, you know, a contracting officer mentioned it in the back, that they're trying to do creative things and push, but there are so many layers, and, you know, you've heard it referred to as the frozen middle. So this is a huge opportunity, risk appetite very, very high, more authorities than we've ever had before. Would be a real shame not to capitalize on it if we can't get the workforce to help implement it. And so I think, you know, whatever we do, industry is ready and willing to partner with the department to help actually implement some of these reforms in a smart way. so that they do take effect and can endure, kind of past the leadership that's in place right now that really is raring to go.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I've had the pleasure and honor to sit behind the Honorable Mr. Feinberg as he's negotiated with certain CEOs across industry. And I tell you, aside from the fact that I actually do get graduate credit for those sessions because there's so much learning going on, I will tell you that exactly what you said, Margaret. Everybody we talk to, and there's different flavors and there's obviously different styles out there. Industry, I know, wants to partner. They want to get into it. So that message is loud and clear. We're sorting through how to do that right now. So let me do this. Let me first say thank you to everybody, to all of our panelists. Thank you to MITRE. Keoki, Leanne, of course, always. Thank you very much for that. Allison, Jessica, and everybody else who I can't name at this point, but you're all back there. Getting this to show up in the room, that's a big feat right there. And then General Van Antwerp, your twin brother and I served together in Europe, and one of the things he said resonates with one of your points, and that is our NCO core. And so when we look at one of our asymmetric advantages over China, it's kind of what you alluded to, it's not just that we have a professional NCO core, we listen to them. So again, thank you very much. Thanks for your attention, and I think we are finishing on time.